Just because I'm a doddering old man, that doesn't mean I live entirely in the past. Only mostly. So, even though all the games I've looked at so far have been from a decade far removed from this one, I have actually played some games that were released in the last 10 years. Nowhere near all of them, of course. In fact, many of the biggest franchises and most popular releases completely passed me by, either through indifference on my part, or lack of money, or lack of time. So I'm not going to pretend that my pick for Game of the Decade is even remotely objective. In fact, if I ever offer a gaming opinion that I claim is objective or in any way superior to other opinions, that's the day I'll pack my bags and move into the old folks' home, because that's when I'll know I truly am a drooling old stick in the mud. In the meantime though, before my failing mind completely cracks, the time seems right to talk about my personal Game of the Decade, plus some honourable mentions. And look, I used to roll my eyes whenever a YouTuber urged people to like and subscribe, but now I'm a YouTuber myself, in the broadest definition of the term. I kind of understand it. Likes are the currency of the online age, and it turns out I'm not above standing in the street, hands metaphorically outstretched, begging for that sweet, sweet validation. So yeah, please like and subscribe, but only if you want to. Okay, first up, the honourable mentions, and I'll begin with Bloodborne. I absolutely loved the Dark Souls games, or at least I really wanted to. Many of my favourite games throughout my life have been Metroidvania-style games, or more broadly speaking, games with non-linear, well-designed environments that slowly reveal their secrets as you explore all their branching paths and hidden corners. And the Dark Souls games do that better than just about everything else. My first few hours with the first Dark Souls were mind-blowing. The world seemed so full of mystery and excitement. Of course, it was also full of danger and challenge. At first I was fine with that. I knew going in that it was a tough game and, given my complete lack of skill, I expected to struggle. And struggle I did. But the allure of the world kept me going. Up to a point. Eventually the frustration just got too much for me, and when I reached the legendarily tough Ornstein and Smuff, I couldn't quite summon the determination to continue. I might have eventually made it past them, but after a while I wasn't inclined to try. I've dipped my toe into the worlds of Dark Souls 2 and 3, but psychologically I was defeated before I started. I really wanted to explore their environments and uncover their secrets, but I strongly suspected I'd just be letting myself in for more frustration than I wanted in my life. Then, with a great deal of trepidation, I tried Bloodborne. And the game devoured me. I fell into its world, and unlike Dark Souls, I stayed there until I had utterly dominated its dark and twisted dreamscapes. I completed the game, and then I completed it twice more so I could see all 3 endings, and then I went through it again, and again, and again. I'm not sure how many times I went through the New Game Plus mode, but it was quite a few. I even got the Platinum Trophy, my first Platinum ever, and that was something I would never have hoped for when I first played the game. Admittedly, it's one of the more straightforward Platinum trophies to acquire, but I was still proud of myself. For me at least, the difficulty of Bloodborne is pitched just right. Needless to say, I died a lot. My corpses would have filled the Grand Canyon. But with every death, I made just enough progress and learned just enough about my foes and the deadly world around me to keep me going. If I'm being honest, it also helped that it's possible to keep farming enemies until you're over-leveled enough to compensate for even my high levels of ineptitude. It's been a long time since a game drew me in the way Bloodborne did, compelling me to uncover every secret I could and to explore the world until I knew it as well as I know my own neighbourhood. I'd go as far as to say it's my favourite game on the PS4, with one possible exception. And that exception is my next honourable mention. Kingdom Hearts 3. I'll say it again, I'm not trying to be objective here. Plenty of people have no interest in Kingdom Hearts or actively dislike it. And that's absolutely fine, I have no argument with that. It's not for everyone. And even amongst those who do like Kingdom Hearts, plenty of people consider Kingdom Hearts 3 to be a disappointment. And I have no argument with that either. I've heard their reasons, and they're valid. For me, though, Kingdom Hearts 3 was everything I hoped it would be, and more. I tried not to set my expectations too high, and to be honest, in the 12 years or so since Kingdom Hearts 2, I started to become a bit cynical about the whole franchise, and suspected that they'd never be able to come up with anything that made the long wait seem worthwhile. But for my money, they did. Graphically speaking, it's just gorgeous and a true generational leap for the series. Well, 2 generations really. And story-wise, it managed to draw together the spaghetti-like narrative threads and weave them into a conclusion that left my heart truly satisfied. My brain, on the other hand, still had a few complaints, but Kingdom Hearts is a rare example of something that can make me favour the heart over the brain. This is a deeply personal thing, but for me there is no other game or book or film or work of art that so perfectly captures the spirit and innocence of childhood like Kingdom Hearts does, as well as the melancholy knowledge that childhood and innocence must be cast aside all too soon. On that note, my next honourable mention went for a rather different emotional tone. It's Doom. But not that one. Nope, I'm talking about this Doom. Or, more accurately, Doom 2. But that didn't come out this decade, I hear you cry, or even the last decade. Well, yes, I know that. My memory isn't quite that addled. So, this entry is actually for all the excellent user-made WODs that have come out over the last 10 years. Thanks to the amazing work of a whole host of talented level designers and mod makers, I keep returning to old school Doom, and I keep discovering new and wonderful things. Personally, I tend to favour map packs that stick fairly close to the traditional Doom design philosophy, but the sheer variety of innovations on offer is amazing, especially considering just how old the underlying technology is. There are so many awesome map packs out there, but I feel I should pick one to stand for all the rest, and I don't need to think too hard about which one that should be. Sunlust is a set of 32 maps that don't do anything to massively alter the core elements of Doom. They're just brilliantly designed to be fun, exciting, and compelling. They're challenging without being unfair, they're intricate without being confusing, and they reward exploration. I played Sunlust at roughly the same time I played the new Doom, and I can honestly say I had significantly more fun with Sunlust. I still play it sometimes, in fact I will definitely be doing a video on it sometime in the near future. Anyway, time for the last of my honourable mentions. Final Fantasy XIV. Or maybe I should specify Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn, because although I may be a Final Fantasy fanboy, I can easily admit that the initial launch of Final Fantasy XIV was simply abysmal and a huge disappointment. But in a tale of redemption that's almost unprecedented in the gaming world, almost a decade on from its initial release, the game has become something phenomenal. In truth, I debated whether I should include this game as an honourable mention. The fact is, I haven't played the most recent expansion, or even most of the one before that. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, after my deep addiction to World of Warcraft, as mentioned in a previous video, I'm kind of burned out on the MMO genre. Secondly, the combat in Final Fantasy XIV is quite slow, almost ponderous compared to other similar games. But damn it, some of the things I have experienced in Final Fantasy XIV are just amazing, especially to a long-time Final Fantasy devotee. And it's just simply beautiful. In fact, FF14 gets my vote as the most aesthetically pleasing game ever created. The world design, the character design, the music, oh dear god, the music. Final Fantasy games have always had the best music in my opinion, but for sheer quantity of awesome tunes, 14 beats them all. Okay, time to announce my pick for Game of the Decade. This is Path of Exile. You click on enemies to kill them and get experience points to go up levels, and if you're lucky, you get a good item. No, sorry, wait, that's something I made myself in 5 minutes. Okay, this is Path of Exile. You click on enemies to kill them and get experience points to go up levels, and if you're lucky, you get a good item. I'm guessing it took more than 5 minutes to make. So why exactly is Path of Exile my game of the decade? Well, a lot of reasons, but I'll start with the most literal, and that's simply because I've been playing it for most of the decade. I first played it in late 2012, when it was still in closed beta. Later, when version 1.0 launched, Path of Exile was free to play, but I was happy to pay for the privilege of getting my hands on it sooner. At that point, I was a huge fan of Diablo 3, which was my first real experience with the whole action RPG genre. I hadn't had the chance to play Diablo 1 or 2, so I came to the third game without any preconceived notions of what it was all about. I know a lot of long-time fans of the series were bitterly disappointed by Diablo 3, but I absolutely loved it, and I became thoroughly addicted. So, when I heard of Path of Exile not long after, I was intrigued. A lot of people had good things to say about it, and many of them considered it to be vastly superior to Diablo 3, so I splashed out some cash to be able to play it. My first impressions were actually not particularly positive. The artwork seemed a little crude, and the overall atmosphere was a lot darker and grittier than Diablo 3's somewhat more stylized aesthetic. For a lot of people, this was a big plus point in Path of Exile's favour, but not so much for me. Of course, it should be pointed out that Diablo 3 was made by Blizzard, a huge company with vast wealth, while Path of Exile was being developed by a relatively small studio based in New Zealand, so of course I cut them a lot of slack for their somewhat less sophisticated graphics. Nevertheless, I definitely preferred the overall aesthetic of Diablo 3. More importantly, the gameplay seemed somewhat slower and clunkier than that of Diablo 3. This perception was partially caused by the fact that my character in Diablo 3 had reached godlike levels of power, so starting a different game as a level 1 weakling was a bit of a shock. But I think it's accurate to say that all things being equal, it did take more time and dedication to reach a point in Path of Exile where you felt truly powerful. It's also undeniable that Path of Exile went for a more unforgiving approach to character development. In Diablo 3 it was possible to completely change your character's skill set in a matter of seconds. In Path of Exile, the way you developed your character was a weighty decision that could not easily be altered. Furthermore, it was very possible to make that decision poorly, leaving your character underpowered and struggling to make any impact on the hordes of monsters and villains that blocked your progress. And indeed, that's what happened to me. 10 to 20 hours into the game, I found myself with a character that would walk into an area infested with enemies, take a few ineffectual swings at them with his rather pathetic battle axe, and then die. I looked for advice online, but the consensus seemed to be that in this situation the best thing to do is start a new character and try to make better decisions. I found that concept too frustrating to contemplate, and so I just went back to Diablo 3 and nuking demons into oblivion with my wizard. I'm not exactly doing a great job of selling Path of Exile as the game of the decade, am I? Don't worry, I'm only up to 2013, there's plenty of the decade left. As time went on, I changed, and more importantly, so did Path of Exile. I started to get a little sick of Diablo 3. It was fun and accessible, sure, but it started to wear a little thin. The Reaper of Souls expansion came out in 2014, and I enjoyed it a lot, but not for all that long. It added some stuff, but didn't make any significant changes. Path of Exile, on the other hand, changed and grew in some remarkable ways, and this brings me to the second reason it is my game of the decade. Even after the full release of the game, the developer, Grinding Gear Games, or GGG, continued to work on it with a dedication and consistency that is truly admirable. When I started playing in the closed beta, there were 3 acts to the main story, the third of which was still incomplete. By the time of the full release in 2013, all 3 acts were complete. Then they released another act in 2015. Then, in 2017, they not only released a 5th act, they also reworked the entire flow of the game. Prior to this, you had to play through the story mode 3 separate times with increasing difficulty and strength of enemies before you could reach the post-game content, which most dedicated players would say is where the game truly starts. This is a fairly common thing in action RPGs, although it always struck me as less than ideal. Now, once you finish the first 5 acts, instead of just doing the exact same thing 5 more times, you instead had 5 more acts in which you revisited the areas you'd already covered, but with vastly altered environments, different locations to discover, new and more challenging enemies, more boss fights, and new story elements. In truth, although these 5 additional acts took place in areas you'd already visited, they changed things enough to count as 5 truly new acts. Basically, with this update, the game more than doubled in size. Let me put this in perspective. In my opinion, the 2015 update, the one that added 1 new act, was a significantly better and more substantial improvement to the overall game than the Reaper of Souls expansion had been for Diablo 3. And the 2017 update, that essentially added 6 new acts, was an order of magnitude bigger than that. Oh, and Reaper of Souls cost around $50 Australian, whereas every single bit of additional content in Path of Exile has been absolutely free. And that brings me to my next reason why Path of Exile is my game of the decade. The fact it does free-to-play right. Right from the beginning, the developers of Path of Exile, GGG, stated that you would never be able to pay for a gameplay advantage in their game. It would resolutely not be pay to win. You cannot buy power, no matter how rich you are, your wealth will not help you kill monsters even 1% faster. And this is an ideal that they have stuck to over the last 8 years or so. Most of the items you can buy with real money are purely cosmetic. Okay, yes, it does need to be acknowledged that if you don't lay out some cash for extra inventory space, you're going to find yourself quite limited in terms of storage. and in a game that largely revolves around the acquisition of ever more powerful armor, weapons, and items, this is going to be a significant problem if you end up playing the game in a serious way. You start with 4 tabs in your stash, and they will fill up rather quickly. So it could be said that while you can never get an actual gameplay advantage by paying real money, if you want to play the game properly, at least some expenditure is required. But honestly, even taking this into consideration, Path of Exile is incredibly good value. I paid roughly $170 Australian all up for Diablo 3, the Reaper of Souls expansion, and the Necromancer character. I've probably spent roughly the same amount on Path of Exile over the years, and I've got far, far more enjoyment out of it. And I should point out that I've spent way more money on the game than I really needed to. I now have much more inventory space than I can realistically use, but I'm a bit of a hoarder, so it's nice to have. Plus, the developers aren't in this business just for fun, they need to make a profit. And if they can do that while also providing an excellent gameplay experience, then that's the way things should work. And it's not just those big expansions with extra acts that GGG have added to the game absolutely free. Every 4 months, what's known as a league starts. These are variants of the game that are only open to new, freshly created characters, which gives new players a chance to start from the same point as everyone else, and veteran players a reason to start from a blank slate and maybe experiment with something new and different. More importantly, each league also introduces a new gameplay element with its own little story and narrative, along with a whole heap of new items for players to track down. Many of these new gameplay elements are really quite significant and provide a fresh way to play the game. The Delve League, for instance, introduced a mine area, essentially an endless dungeon with countless branching paths that lead to a huge variety of different encounters and treasure troves. This addition, almost a separate game in its own right, proved to be very popular. The Abyss League introduced fractures that opened up in the ground, letting loose floods of monsters from the underworld, and leading to special treasure chests or even caves that sometimes contained a new type of gem that could potentially be extremely valuable. The recent Blight League introduced a kind of tower defense mode, culminating in massive battles where countless enemies marched relentlessly towards your base, crashing computers around the world and basically rendering the console versions of the game unplayable. Still pretty fun though.
It's put out new mycelium. New roots.
These special leagues only last for around 4 months, after which any characters you created are dumped back to the standard league. In many cases though, including those I just mentioned, the new gameplay element is retained and included both in the standard league and all future special leagues. This means that nowadays there are just so many different things to encounter during your travels, so many different challenges to overcome and items to find. The amount of content in Path of Exile is just mind-boggling. But that's all big picture stuff. I haven't even really talked about the specifics of the gameplay yet, but of course it's a crucial element and the next reason Path of Exile is my game of the decade. My earlier description of clicking on enemies to get items and levels was facetious, but fundamentally accurate. And it's what this game is all about. You traverse the many and varied environments, using spells and abilities to dispatch foes, and you use the items and experience points you get in the process to enable you to traverse more dangerous environments, acquire more devastating spells and abilities, and find better items and more experience points, which you use to enable you to traverse more dangerous environments, acquire more devastating spells and abilities, and find better items and more experience points, which you use to enable you to traverse more dangerous environments, and I think you get the idea. But that's the central gameplay loop, and I totally understand why some people might find that utterly unappealing. A friend of mine, explaining why he never played action RPGs, described them as a fancy graphical user interface for a random number generator. And that's fair enough, really. The fun of the game comes from figuring out how to get that random number generator to throw out as many numbers as possible, while also ensuring that the randomness stops being so random and starts tipping in your favour. And again, I totally understand if that sounds like the opposite of fun to you. But Path of Exile gives you so many tools to work with, and so many different ways to work with them, that if you have the right mindset, there is endless enjoyment to be had. There's also the pure destructive satisfaction that comes from starting out as a weakling with a pathetic little fireball spell, for example, and growing into an all-consuming avatar of explodey death. Let's look at the abilities you have access to. There are literally hundreds of them. To use this specific ability, you need to place the right ability gem into a socket on your armour. You gain access to these gems as you progress through the story, but you might also find them as random drops from enemies or treasure chests. You can augment these abilities by placing support gems into a socket that's linked with the socket that contains the ability gem. For instance, you might be using a fireball gem and link it with a multiple projectile support gem, which makes you shoot 3 fireballs at a time, rather than just one. Or you could link it with a support gem that lets you cast the spell more quickly, or one that makes the explosions bigger, or one that makes you likely to land a critical strike. Or why not all of those at once? If you find a piece of armour with enough sockets that are all linked together, you can link an ability gem with up to 5 support gems. And then you can put other ability gems in other pieces of armour and augment them with support gems. You'll find yourself mixing and matching spells and abilities until you hit upon a combination you like, and that, with enough tweaking, might turn out to be an arsenal of unyielding death and destruction. I know it all sounds confusing, but take a look at my character here. This is a character I created a few months ago, and has ended up becoming possibly the most powerful character I've ever used. Which, incidentally, isn't necessarily saying much. I've played this game a hell of a lot, but I'm not particularly hardcore when it comes to tweaking characters and items to absolutely maximise their power. I prefer to mess around and experiment as I go along. Anyway, this character uses the Cyclone skill to do most of their damage. It's quite a popular skill as it allows you to move around freely while spinning like a whirlwind that's been possessed by the Tasmanian devil and then somehow infused with the power of a nuclear bomb. I've socketed the gem in my sword, which as you can see has 6 linked sockets, allowing me to put in 5 support gems. I've elected to go with this one, which lets me do extra damage so long as I have full health, and this one, which lets me do more damage but decreases the size of my whirlwind of death, and this one, which just flat out increases the damage of the attack, and this one, which lets me do more damage the longer I use the ability for, and finally this one, which increases the physical damage the attack does, but means it can't do any elemental damage, which essentially means magic damage. And that's fine, because I'm swinging a giant sword around. I'm not really interested in magic with this character. You can also see I've got gems in other pieces of armour, giving me more abilities. For instance, I have the Leap Slam ability, which is very handy for jumping right on top of enemies, or if the need arises, for leaping away to safety like a big cowardly gazelle. Furthermore, I've used support gems to make it so any enemy I hit with this attack is cursed with vulnerability, letting me do more damage to them. Additionally, any time I hit an enemy with it, I gain the Fortify status, which makes me take less damage. So, by using the right gems, I've got an ability that not only lets me race around at high speed, but also weakens my enemies and protects me. This is just one small example of the way that skills can be augmented and combined in a creative, effective, and sometimes surprising ways, and there's a great deal of fun and satisfaction to be had with it if, I repeat, you have the right mindset for it, which I do. And, look, I could literally spend hours going into all the minute details of how items and gems and abilities work. I could talk at length about how items increase your character's statistics, and how satisfying it is to come across one that has high stats in just the areas you need. And I could honestly spend hours and hours after that talking about the crafting system, and how, with enough investment of time and resources, you can use it to create the perfect item for your character. I could spend yet more hours talking about how the game encourages and facilitates trading between players, thus making the crafting system incredibly lucrative for those who choose to devote the time and resources to it, while making it essentially optional for those, like me, who are basically happy to let other people worry about that sort of thing. Just listing the things that would take too long to talk about would take too long in itself, and at some point, which I may already have reached, this video is going to seem less like a review of my game of the decade, and more like a university lecture in some esoteric form of mathematics. But there are a couple more things I want to briefly touch on. This is the passive skill tree, and this is only a small section of it. Let me just zoom out. This is the thing that tends to make people either run away from this game screaming, or to download it immediately. It can look intimidating and overly complicated, but it's really not. Basically, this is how you build your character's inherent strengths, separate to whatever armor and abilities they may have equipped. Every level you go up, you get 1 skill point, and you get a few more as you progress through the story mode, up to a maximum of about 120. You can use those skill points to activate any node on the skill tree, so long as it's linked to a node you've already activated, or to your character's starting position in the tree. Let's take a look at how I use my skill points for one particular character. This character is a Marauder, so he starts here. The nodes around the Marauder's starting area tend to focus on physical strength, melee damage, and health. Now, I'm not actually going to use this character for melee attacks, but health is incredibly valuable for most playstyles, so I activate as many nodes as I can that increase health. Then, because I want to use fire magic with this character, I head up the tree to where there are a lot of nodes that increase magic damage and effects. You'll notice that there are a lot of small nodes and fewer large nodes. As you might be able to guess, the larger nodes have a greater effect. There are also even larger nodes known as keystone nodes, and these ones tend to alter your character in ways that have a significant impact on their playstyle. In this case, I activate a keystone node that removes all my mana, which is the resource you need to cast spells, and instead lets me use my health for casting. This obviously has a significant downside. If you run out of health you die, and if you have to use up your health to cast spells, you're just going to die all the sooner. But because my character has a lot of health and also regenerates quite a large chunk of health every second, it doesn't end up making too much of a difference, and just means that I don't have to worry about mana. So that's the skill tree. A lot of people see this and worry about messing things up and creating a character that's really underpowered. And that's not a totally unwarranted concern. If you don't know what you're doing, you almost certainly end up with a character that's unoptimized at best. But one of the changes that the game has made over the years is to become significantly more forgiving. So long as you just aim for nodes that seem to complement your playstyle, for instance elemental damage if you're a spellcaster, or bow damage if you're using ranged weapons, you'll probably be able to clear the story mode at least, and then you can start working on fixing any mistakes and creating something a bit more efficient and effective. And honestly, that's all part of the fun. Finding something that kind of works, then figuring out something a bit better, and working towards getting better gear and tweaking your skill tree, it can be incredibly satisfying. Just to give some examples of how you can use the skill tree to create different types of characters using different spells and abilities, I'll run through some of the characters I've created over the years. This is the Marauder whose skill tree I just demonstrated. He's a purely fire-based character who uses the Incinerate spell to immolate pretty much everything, while relying on high health to shrug off most enemy attacks. This is my Raider, an extremely fast-moving character who throws out ballistas that rain down fireballs on the enemies while shooting explosive arrows from her bow. This is my Necromancer, who relies almost entirely on her army of powerful spectres and zombies to do the killing for her. And this is my Saboteur, who lays down mines that shoot out icicles when triggered, freezing and shattering just about everything on screen. These are just a few of the many different ways you can build your character. And this is something else that people can find a little intimidating, but it really shouldn't be. My advice to any new player is just to decide which playstyle you want to try out, for instance magic damage or melee attacks or bow attacks. Check a wiki or ask on the forums to find which class best suits that style, then dive in and just see how it goes. Everything else can be picked up as you go along. It's worth mentioning that there is a very good community around this game who do seem to be genuinely happy to help new players. Well, finally, I should probably talk about the aesthetics of the game. I said earlier that I initially found the game's art to be a little too dark and dingy for my taste, and in certain areas that's still true, but as the game has grown with the addition of new areas, there's been a lot more variety and some more splashes of colour, and just a general improvement in quality. Spell effects have also greatly improved over time, helped by the introduction of new lighting technology. I will say that I still think the character designs, at least for the player characters, are kind of lacking, as are the armour and item designs. In fact, I have been tempted to wonder if the armour has been intentionally made rather dull and ugly to encourage people to spend real money on cosmetic items, which can be very visually appealing. I'm not sure if that's true, but I'd say it's plausible. The enemy designs, on the other hand, have continued to improve over the years, especially when it comes to the bosses. Although the last boss of the story mode is kind of a letdown, in my opinion. As for sound, this is an area where the game truly excels. The music is low-key but perfectly atmospheric and skillfully crafted. The sound effects do an excellent job of giving you an oral indication of what's happening.
Practice makes perfect.
And the voice acting is actually amongst the best I've ever heard in a game, helped significantly by the surprisingly high quality of the writing.
Arohongui, daughter of the moon, was preparing for a feast to celebrate Tukohama's return from his war on the first ones of the Ezamites. Tafor, son of the forest, asked each of the birds to sacrifice one of their kind for the feast. He gave these offerings to Arohongui, who cooked them in a great firestone pit. Seeing all of those plump birds cooking made Kitava very hungry, and he offered to watch them, to make sure they didn't burn while Arohongui rested during the heat of the day. Arohongui thanked Kitava for his kindness, but while she slept, Kitava ate the cooking birds, flesh, bones, gizzards and all. Upon waking, Arohongui was furious to find that Kitava had lied to her, for saying that he would watch the birds when he truly intended to eat them all up. When Tukohama arrived home in his mighty canoe, Arohongui asked him to punish Kitava for his selfish gluttony. Tukohama, our father of war, agreed and pulled the sharpest tooth from his own mouth. He then asked Arohongui and Tafor to hold Kitava fast while he cut Kitava's face with the tooth. 2 slashes that blinded Kitava and formed a bleeding cross upon his face. From that day forth, Kitava would never be able to promise to watch that which he truly intended to consume.
This isn't a cinematic game. Most of the key narrative elements are revealed to you through NPC dialogue, as well as books and items scattered throughout the world, but that dialogue is crafted particularly well, and it's all voice acted with great skill. Well, almost all of it. There are 1 or 2 characters that fall a bit flat, but on the whole it really is a cut above just about every other game, many of which have vastly bigger budgets. Well, I really should wrap things up about now, even though there's still so much to talk about. I haven't even gotten into the map system, which provides essentially endless new challenges once you finish the main story, and which... Nope, I can't get into that, or this video will also be endless. I'll just finish by saying that if anything I've said about Path of Exile piques your interest, you should give it a go. Even the console versions are worth playing, which is a minor miracle for a game like this, where inventory management is such a big part of it. And if nothing I've said piques your interest, well done on making it this far into a video. That must have been a form of torture for you. Okay, thanks for watching. Happy New Year, Happy New Decade. Not that any of it means anything. It's all just an arbitrary date for marking an arbitrary number of orbits around the sun. Until next time then, get off my lawn.